The psalmist said in Psalm 14, attributed to David, at the beginning of verse 1, he says, "The fool has said in his heart, there is no God." Maybe a verse that we all know well or have heard or are familiar with in some way. But have we ever stopped to think about, have you ever thought about it? Have you ever really stopped and thought about those words? The fool has said in his heart. It doesn't simply say that a person who says such a thing is wrong, or that they're in error, or even that maybe that it's unwise to say that. It's incorrect. But he says the person who says that, even in his heart, is a fool. A fool. Why does it make a person a fool to believe there is no God? Why would that make a person, according to the Scriptures, you'd have to be a fool to believe that. So why? Why would only a fool say that, especially at a time today where there are so many people who at least claim to believe that there is no God? I'm not so sure. I'm not quite convinced that most of those people actually believe that. But there are plenty who claim that. Is there a reason to believe that there is a God? It seems that there is. Or else, you wouldn't be a fool to say that there's not a God. In logic, there is such a thing as the law of excluded middle. You probably heard me talk about it before, but basically what it means is every single thing either is or it is not. For instance, there either is milk in your refrigerator right now, or there is not milk in your refrigerator right now. Or the milk that is in your refrigerator either is spoiled or the milk is not spoiled. The point is, there is no third option. That's why it's called excluded middle. There's just two options in this case. In both examples, no middle ground, no third option. And that applies also to the question of God. God either is or he is not. There is no third option. One of those two things is true. Period. One of them is true. Sometimes you might have a list of options, and the real options are any of the things on that list, or possibly more than one thing on the list, or possibly none of the things on the list is the truth. Sometimes that's the case. But in this case, one of those two things has to be true, must be true, that God is or God is not. The trick with this question, when we ask the question of how do we know that God exists? The tricky thing about that is you can't use the Bible. If somebody comes to you who claims to not believe in God, and they come to you and they say, "I want you to show me, prove to me that God exists," they're not going to care what the Bible says. You can't just turn to Genesis 1:1 and say, "Bible says it. God created the heavens and the earth, so God exists. He's there. He's the one." They're not going to care about that. Is there a way that a person can prove that God exists without even opening their Bible? Yeah, there is. There's more than one way, in fact. This was not a question, though, that would have been very popular or commonly asked the further back in time you go, the less likely it probably would have been for this question to even be asked. Is God real? Does God exist? Whatever somebody might think God is, they would have pretty much been in agreement that there is at least one God out there. there is a God. Question back then probably would have been more like which God is better and stronger, which God is the best God, as we see many times pop up in the Scriptures, in the Old Testament narrative and in history. But in the last couple of centuries, I would say probably especially the last half century or three-quarter centuries, it's been more frequently asked, does God exist? And therefore, the questions that we're entertaining here. Do I have any reason to believe in God? If you don't have a reason to believe in something, you shouldn't believe it, no matter what it is. If there's no reason to believe that thing, you shouldn't believe that thing. Is there anything to compel or lead men to conclude that God is real? Or is faith a purely emotional, subjective leap in the dark? Why do people believe in God? The Hebrews writer said in Hebrews 11:1 that he describes faith as the conviction of things not seen. One of those things not seen, strictly speaking, is God. We can't see God. But you know what? There is a big difference between the conviction of things not seen and the conviction of things for which there is no evidence. That is not what the writer says. He does not say that faith is the conviction of things that you have absolutely no reason to believe. You just need to believe it. That's not what he says. It's a conviction of things not seen. But just because something is not seen does not mean that the thing does not exist. Just because I can't physically see something. And there are plenty of examples we could consider for that. Whenever you may be walking through the woods and you come upon a campsite that has a little campfire that is still smoking maybe, or still is a little bit warm. You know and understand this as 100% unmistakable evidence that there is somebody in the general area because they've recently been here. They're somewhere because there's evidence. There's something that leads you to conclude that. So many examples like that could be multiplied. There's evidence. Here is something that proves that there is something that I can't see is out there because there's evidence for it. It shows it. It proves it. And that's the key word here, prove. Prove that God, something that we can't see, exists. Paul said in Romans chapter 1, verses 19 to 20, "For what can be known about God is plain to them," he's talking about the ancient Gentiles, "because God has shown it to them. For ever since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes have been clearly perceived in the things that have been made." So they're without excuse, he says. Why are they without excuse? Because God has filled to the brim his creation with evidence that that's exactly what it is. He's filled the universe to the brim with evidence that he is and that he is responsible for it. However, the tragic reality is that as he goes on in Romans chapter 1, many people refuse not to honor God. Or they refuse to honor him. They choose not to honor God or to give thanks to him. They're futile in their thinking. They have darkened in foolish hearts. They're fools, he says. Just like the psalmist said, just like David said. They exchange the truth about God for a lie and worship the creature rather than the Creator. So is there a way that I can prove without saying the Bible says so, that God exists? In fact, there are. We're going to look at 3. But first, a few honorable mentions that I'll just say in passing. Law requires a lawmaker. We know one way that you can prove that God exists is because if there is any law that exists in this universe, and there must be someone who put that law into place. Just like on earth. A law, speed limit, you name it. is a sign that somebody has put that law into place. It can't be there if someone hasn't put it into place. Code. If there is code in the universe, it requires a coder. Think about DNA and how intricate that is. Arguably one of the greatest discoveries ever in all history. Are we really to believe that something as intricate as the DNA code could be the result of some accident? Is that really the scientific answer, the scientific explanation? If there's code, it requires a coder or communication. Man's exclusive ability to speak intelligibly and write and read and communicate with each other in a way different than the animal kingdom does is evidence that someone gave him that ability. But these are just some ones that we don't have time to look further into. We are going to spend the rest of our time, just a few minutes, looking at three. And let me just say, these three ways to prove that God exists they do the job on their own. You don't need all three. Any one of them is proof that God exists. And I encourage you to commit at least a little bit of this to memory, just to have ready for when somebody might ask you, give me a reason, prove to me that God exists. And by the way, let me also say, the burden of proof for the existence of God is not on the person who believes that God exists, it's on the person who says he doesn't. And yet, they will demand of you the proof. Thankfully, there's plenty. And here we'll look at three ways. Number one, it's called the cosmological argument. That's the fancy word it's been called anyway. But here's basically the idea. Every creation must have a creator, or we might say cause and effect. Everything that exists must have something greater than it that caused it to be there, that caused it to exist. No matter what it is, every effect must have an adequate cause. So here's the dilemma. In fact, most highly revered people in the scientific community have even observed, some of them at least, that the notion of an effect without a cause is not science, it's witchcraft, to quote one. It's witchcraft. Something without a cause? So here's the dilemma. The universe exists. No denying that, unless you want to believe we're in a computer simulation or this is all a dream. The universe exists. By the way, if we were in a computer simulation, that's still something that would need an explanation. The universe exists, and therefore it must be explained. But there are only three options for explaining the universe. Number one, it's eternal. There's one option. The universe is eternal. It's always been here. It's here now because it's always been here. Okay, that's option number one. Option number two, it hasn't always been here, but it created itself, which of necessity would have to mean it came from nothing. Created itself from nothing. And number three, the universe was created by some outside being or force, something anterior and superior to itself. Those are the three options. There are really no other options. Well, according to purely scientific data even, the universe is not eternal. So there goes option number one. The universe is not eternal. You can't have something that comes from nothing. Impossible. No matter what, nothing times nothing equals nothing every single time. Period. You put nothing in a room, In fact, nothing plus nothing times a billion years still equals nothing. You put nothing in a room, airtight, seal it, leave it for a billion years, come back, there will be nothing in that room. You can leave it for another 100 billion years, come back, there will be nothing in that room, because something cannot come from nothing on its own. It's impossible. How could it? So there goes option number 2. That leaves only one option. It has to have been, it must have been created by some intelligent power that outside of itself. The Bible agrees with that. And you only have to read pretty much one verse, the very first verse, to see that. Hebrews writer also said in Hebrews 3:4, every house is built by someone. Can't help but notice, kind of sounds like the cause and effect. Every house is built by somebody, which leads to number 2. Similarly, it's called the teleological argument. Design demands a designer. When there is design found in something, there must have been someone who designed that. Something designed that. Put that design in. And the reality is we do find design in nature. Tons of it. Patterns, designs. So there must have been a designer. And one of the most amazing evidences of the existence of God is the human body and the design of it. How could the human body have ever come to exist? Or any body for that matter. How could it have come to exist? Because there are certain parts that are vital to the survival of the body, but that can't live without other parts that are vital to the survival of the body. And so if you take either one of them out, you die. But they couldn't have just come to be by themselves at the exact same time. How can we explain the design, the systems of the human body, the way everything works together? And sometimes our bodies may not work as well as we wish they did, but there's still the design in all of it, in the way that it works. Every single thing you do is because something in your body, your brain, is sending signals to it to do it. It all works together. There is undeniable design, and that, just like we talked about the DNA code. Design. It demands a designer. You come upon a building of any kind, even a simple, ugly building. You know somebody designed that. Somebody built that. Nobody would ever suggest that thing just formed itself over however many years, because it can't. Design demands a designer. So if there is design in the universe, there has to have been a designer, someone who designed that universe. And thirdly, the anthropological argument, it's been called, which is based in morality. A moral code requires a moral mind. The thing is, even though man is inclined to depravity many, many times, there is a general code of morality to some extent, and has been throughout all time, in every culture and location. What we're talking about here is just the very concept of wrong. Now, sure, different societies and cultures, and even today in our society and culture, people are going to disagree about what is wrong, which things are wrong, but just the very concept of wrong, how did that come to be? I don't see wrong in the animal kingdom. I've never seen a lion or something who's about to attack some prey and suddenly stop itself and, because I shouldn't do that, it's wrong. There's none of that. How did the concept of wrong even come to be? How did it come to exist? Forget what a culture might say is wrong and right, just wrong in general. We can understand right. It's easy. The concept of right is almost automatic. You do anything you want. If everything's right, you do anything you want, and that's how things would be anyway. But the concept of wrong, where does that come from? How can we explain, for instance, the nearly universal and eternal law that murder is wrong? Murder's wrong. Where'd that come from? At some point, did man just decide that X, Y, or Z is wrong and you shouldn't do it? Not likely. Doesn't really make any sense. There's really no scientific answer to this question. Atheism cannot answer that question, but the Bible does. God is the reason. God is where that came from. If there is no God, there is no right and wrong, period. So if there is right and wrong, if there is wrong, if there is a moral code that exists, no matter how much people might differ on what that code is, it requires a moral mind. There must be a God. There are so many things besides these three that you can point to directly that, again, we're talking about there has to be a God. God has to exist. You cannot exist if God does not exist. And if you exist, then God exists. If you can think in your mind God does not exist, then you've just proved that God does exist. Because if God didn't exist, you wouldn't be able to think He doesn't exist. Or think that He does exist, for that matter. You wouldn't be able to think at all. You wouldn't even be. You wouldn't exist. If you can look in the mirror, you've proven that God exists. If you see a bird fly onto a tree, that's proof that God exists. The tree itself is proof that God exists. It's all proof that God exists. Once you get down to it, if you examine to the utmost every single little aspect of the universe, the only possible conclusion is God. It all points to God, every single little thing. So, if there is anything that is in existence, it has to have had a cause. Can't explain it otherwise. So what was that cause? Can't say, well, it was just this little tiny thing that was 1/billionth the size of an atom and it exploded once, billions of years ago. Well, where'd that little thing that was 1/billionth the size of an atom come from? It had to come from something, because it may be tiny, but it's still a thing. And so somebody had to have created that thing. There's no evidence that ever happened anyway, but even if it did, something had to create that thing. So that's not an adequate explanation. Design, a moral code, laws, all these things. And by the way, the immaculate way that our solar system works and the earth itself is, again, and such a powerful proof of God. The way we're in the perfect position and the perfect distance from the sun. We are going around the sun at the perfect rate. We're actually turning as we go around, and we're tilted. The earth is tilted. How do we explain all that? I sure hope it's not an accident, because that's scary. Thankfully, we know it wasn't an accident. It's absurd. No wonder the psalmist said, the fool says there is no God. Because as I just pointed out, saying there is no God is proof that there is a God. Thinking it in your mind is already proof that there is a God. And so, Hebrews 11:6 says, without faith it is impossible to please Him, for whoever would draw near to God must believe that He is, and that He rewards those who seek after Him. Why do I believe in God? Why do you believe in God? I hope it's not just because somebody told you that. We need to be able to answer people who don't believe the Bible. Now, if somebody who claims to believe the Bible asks you, why do we believe God exists? By all means. You can start with the Bible, perhaps. But somebody who doesn't believe the Bible wants proof. There's no lack of it. Take your pick. It all proves beyond the shadow of a doubt to any honest person that God exists. And therefore, as Paul said, we have no excuse. If we want to draw near to God, though, we have to first of all believe that He is, and that is that He exists, and that He rewards those who seek after Him. Every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. You may have somebody in your life that refuses to believe that God exists, and when somebody subscribes to that, it affects their life. Just like believing that there is a God should affect your life, the way you behave, the way you think, the way you view life, the way you do everything. Have you tried to reach them with an answer, proof, the evidence? Always follow the evidence. What does the evidence actually point to? It points to God. But have we communicated that to people? Have we tried to communicate that to people? Believing in the existence of God is, you might say, the very first, that's the first step that anybody must take to come to the true knowledge of the truth and to come to Jesus Christ. You can't believe in Jesus if you don't even believe in God. And we have a growing population, it seems, who are being taught and conditioned to, and deceived, really, to believing that there is no God. They don't give them the evidence. They withhold it. They're hiding the truth from our young people and anybody else who will listen. So we need to try to give the truth to them, reveal it to them. But what about me particularly? I may believe that God exists, but am I seeking after Him? Am I trying to draw near to Him by obeying the gospel, obeying His commands, doing as He's instructed? There is plenty of evidence for the existence of God, and there is plenty of evidence that the book that we call the Bible is His Word, inspired of the Spirit. And so are we drawing near to God by drawing closer through this? The good news is, even if I haven't, I can start drawing nearer to God in my own personal life. And you know what? That's going to make anything that you tell and communicate to other people all that more powerful, the closer you are to God.